Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we'll explore a tragic true crime case that shook the Vancouver, Washington community and ultimately changed domestic violence laws across the state. This is the story of Tiffany Ojeda Hill, a mother who fought to protect herself and her children, and the systemic failures that cost her everything. On a crisp autumn evening in Vancouver, Washington, the parking lot of Sarah J. Anderson Elementary School should have been a place of safety. Parents picking up their children, the sound of laughter echoing from the playground, the simple rhythm of suburban family life. But on November 26, 2019, this peaceful scene would become the backdrop for an unthinkable tragedy that would forever change how Washington state approaches domestic violence cases. Tiffany Ojeda Hill was 35 years old, a former Marine Corps sergeant who had served her country with honor. She was a mother of 3 young children who looked to her for protection, guidance, and love. Tiffany had the kind of strength that comes from military service, but she also possessed a gentleness that made her beloved by friends and family. Those who knew her described a woman who was fiercely protective of her children, someone who would do anything to keep them safe. But safety was something that had become increasingly elusive for Tiffany. Her estranged husband, Kelland Hill, 38 years old, had become a source of terror rather than comfort. What had once been a marriage had deteriorated into a pattern of abuse, control, and escalating violence that would ultimately prove fatal. The signs had been building for months, perhaps even years. Like many domestic violence situations, the abuse likely began subtly, controlling behavior masked as care, jealousy disguised as love, isolation presented as protection. But by September 2019, the violence had become undeniable and dangerous. On a September evening that year, neighbors heard shouting coming from the Hill residence. The argument escalated until Kelland physically assaulted Tiffany, pushing her forcefully into a wall. When Tiffany attempted to call 911 for help, Kelland tried to prevent her from making the call, adding another layer of control and intimidation to his attack. The police were eventually called, and Kelland was arrested for domestic violence assault. This incident marked a turning point, not toward safety, but toward a more dangerous phase of their relationship. Kelland was released from jail the following day with a no-contact order, a piece of paper that was supposed to protect Tiffany but would prove woefully inadequate against a man determined to maintain control. Following his release, Kelland's behavior became even more erratic and threatening. He repeatedly violated the no-contact order, finding ways to monitor and stalk Tiffany that demonstrated both his obsession and his complete disregard for legal boundaries. According to Vancouver Police Sergeant Tanya Wolstein, who investigated the case, Kelland's violations were numerous and escalating. He would follow Tiffany, show up at places where he knew she would be, and even went so far as to place a tracking device on her car. The tracking device was particularly chilling. It showed a level of premeditation and surveillance that went far beyond impulsive anger. Kelland was systematically monitoring Tiffany's movements, learning her patterns, and ensuring that no matter where she went, he would be able to find her. For Tiffany, this meant that even when she thought she was safe, even when she was following all the legal protections supposedly in place, she was being watched. In October 2019, with Kelland's violations mounting and his behavior becoming increasingly threatening, Tiffany took the step that victims of domestic violence are always advised to take. She obtained a domestic violence protective order. This legal document was supposed to provide her with additional protection and give law enforcement more tools to keep Kelland away from her and the children. In her request for the protective order, Tiffany's words were both heartbreaking and prophetic. She wrote, "I fear for my life," a simple sentence that contained the weight of her daily terror. She went on to explain that her husband is getting angrier, describing an escalation that she could see and feel but seemed powerless to stop. Most chillingly, she wrote that, if he had a gun, he would definitely use it against me. These weren't the words of someone being overly dramatic or seeking attention. These were the carefully considered observations of a woman who knew her abuser intimately, who had lived with his violence and threats, and who understood better than anyone the danger she faced. Tiffany had served in the Marines, she understood violence, she understood weapons, and she understood threat assessment. When she said she feared for her life, it was a professional as well as personal judgment. But despite this protective order, despite the no-contact orders, despite the arrests and court appearances, Kelland continued his campaign of terror. He violated the protective order multiple times, each violation demonstrating his complete disregard for the law and his determination to maintain control over Tiffany's life. As Kelland's violations mounted, the criminal justice system was faced with a clear pattern of escalating domestic violence. Each violation should have been seen as evidence that previous measures were insufficient, that Kelland posed a serious and ongoing threat, and that more substantial intervention was needed. In November 2019, Kelland was arrested again for violating the protective order. This arrest presented the court system with a critical decision point. Here was a man with a clear pattern of domestic violence, multiple violations of court orders, and a victim who had explicitly stated she feared for her life. The prosecutor in the case, Deputy Prosecutor Lauren Boyd, understood the gravity of the situation and the danger Tiffany faced. When Kelland's bail hearing came before Clark County Superior Court Judge John Fairgrieve, Prosecutor Boyd made a request that reflected the seriousness of the threat. She asked that Kelland's bail be set at $2 million, an amount that would have kept him in custody and unable to harm Tiffany. She also requested that if he were to be released, he should be required to wear electronic monitoring, which would have allowed authorities to track his movements and potentially alert Tiffany if he came near her. But it wasn't just the prosecutor who understood the danger. Tiffany herself appeared at the hearing, something that required tremendous courage for a domestic violence victim. Standing before the judge, with her abuser present in the same courtroom, Tiffany made a plea that was both desperate and prescient. She told Judge Fairgrieve that if Kelland was released, "He's going to kill me." These 4 words, "he's going to kill me," represented everything that was wrong with how the system was responding to Tiffany's situation. Here was a victim, clearly and explicitly stating that she believed her life was in immediate danger if her abuser was released. She had already provided evidence of his escalating behavior, his repeated violations of court orders, and his complete disregard for legal consequences. She was literally begging for protection. Despite this plea, despite the prosecutor's request, despite the clear pattern of escalating violence, Judge Fairgrieve made a decision that would prove fatal. He released Kelland Hill on bail, setting the amount at a fraction of what the prosecutor had requested. Kelland walked out of that courtroom a free man, free to continue his campaign against the woman who had dared to leave him. The period between Kelland's release and the final tragedy was likely filled with terror for Tiffany. She knew, with the certainty that comes from intimate knowledge of an abuser, that his release meant her life was in danger. She had done everything the system told her to do. She had called police, obtained protective orders, cooperated with prosecutors, and even appeared in court to plead for protection. Yet despite all of this, the person who posed the greatest threat to her life was free to come after her. During this time, Tiffany was trying to maintain some semblance of normal life for her 3 children. She was still taking them to school, still trying to be the mother they needed, still attempting to shield them from the full extent of the danger that surrounded their family. The children, who should have been worried about homework and friends and childhood concerns, were instead living in the shadow of their father's violence. Tiffany's mother was also deeply involved in trying to protect her daughter and grandchildren. She understood the threat Kelland posed and was helping Tiffany navigate the impossible situation of trying to stay safe while still living her life. The two women were working together, watching out for each other, trying to create some measure of safety in an inherently unsafe situation. But Kelland was also using this time, likely planning and watching, using the tracking device he had placed on Tiffany's car to monitor her movements and identify opportunities. He knew her routines, he knew where she would be and when, and he was preparing to act on the threats he had been making. The day started like any other school day. Tiffany was preparing to pick up her children from Sarah J. Anderson Elementary School, a routine task that millions of parents perform every day across the country. Her mother was with her, providing support and assistance in what had become the simple but dangerous task of existing while being stalked by an abuser. The school parking lot should have been safe. It was a public place, filled with other parents and school staff, located in a community where such violence was unthinkable. But for domestic violence victims, nowhere is truly safe when their abuser is determined to find them. As Tiffany and her mother sat in their vehicle, waiting in the school parking lot, Kelland appeared. Whether he had followed them using the tracking device or had simply learned their routine through his stalking, he had found them in what should have been a moment of ordinary family life. What happened next unfolded with the terrible swiftness of planned violence. Kelland approached the vehicle where Tiffany sat with her mother and her 3 children. In broad daylight, in a school parking lot, surrounded by other families, he opened fire. Tiffany was struck and killed almost immediately. The woman who had served her country, who had fought to protect her children, who had begged the court system for protection, was gunned down by the man she had warned everyone would kill her. Her final moments were spent in the terror she had been living with for months, the terror that the system had failed to take seriously enough to prevent. Her mother, who had been trying to help and protect her daughter, was also shot. She was struck 3 times but survived, though with serious injuries. The trauma of witnessing her daughter's murder while being shot herself is something that would mark the rest of her life. The 3 children were in the vehicle during the shooting. While they were physically unharmed, they witnessed their father murder their mother and shoot their grandmother. The psychological trauma of this experience is unimaginable. These children, who should have been picked up from school for an afternoon of homework and play, instead watched their family destroyed by violence. After shooting Tiffany and her mother, Kelland fled the scene in his vehicle. The shooting had been witnessed by multiple people, and police were called immediately. What followed was a brief chase as law enforcement pursued the man who had just committed murder in broad daylight in front of his own children. The chase didn't last long. At the intersection of Patton Parkway and Anderson Road, Kelland stopped his vehicle. Perhaps he realized that there was no escape from what he had done, or perhaps this had always been part of his plan. In his final act of violence, Kelland turned the gun on himself, firing a single shot to his head. Both Tiffany and Kelland were pronounced dead, bringing to an end a domestic violence case that had escalated from threats to murder despite multiple interventions by the criminal justice system. But the story didn't end with their deaths. In many ways, the most important part of the story was just beginning. The murder of Tiffany Hill sent shockwaves through the Vancouver community and the broader criminal justice system in Washington state. Here was a case where a victim had done everything right. She had reported the abuse, obtained protective orders, cooperated with law enforcement, and even appeared in court to warn of the danger. Yet despite all of these interventions, the system had failed to protect her. Judge Fairgrieve, who had made the decision to release Kelland on bail despite the prosecutor's requests and Tiffany's pleas, later spoke about the case. He said he just felt terrible about what had happened, acknowledging the weight of his decision. But feeling terrible wasn't enough to bring Tiffany back or to undo the trauma inflicted on her children and mother. The case highlighted fundamental flaws in how domestic violence cases are handled by the courts. Too often, judges view domestic violence through the lens of property crime or simple assault, failing to understand the unique dynamics of intimate partner violence and the escalating danger that victims face. The fact that Tiffany had explicitly warned that Kelland would kill her if released should have been given much greater weight in the bail decision. Prosecutor Lauren Boyd, who had requested the higher bail and electronic monitoring, became a vocal advocate for changes in how domestic violence cases are handled. She had understood the danger Tiffany faced and had tried to prevent the tragedy, but the system hadn't supported her efforts to protect the victim. Tiffany's death became a catalyst for legislative change in Washington state. Lawmakers, advocates, and community members recognized that her murder represented a systemic failure that needed to be addressed through policy changes. State Senator Linda Wilson introduced legislation that would become known as the Tiffany Hill Act. This law was designed to give courts additional tools to protect domestic violence victims by allowing judges to order accused abusers to wear GPS ankle monitoring devices. These devices would be monitored by officials and linked to an app on the victim's phone, providing real-time alerts when the offender came near. The concept was simple but powerful. If someone was accused of domestic violence and released on bail, technology could be used to monitor their compliance with no-contact orders and to warn victims when they were in danger. It was exactly the kind of protection that might have saved Tiffany's life if it had been available and utilized in her case. The bill passed through the Washington state legislature and was signed into law, creating a permanent memorial to Tiffany in the form of legal protections for future domestic violence victims. The Tiffany Hill Act represented a recognition that the traditional approaches to domestic violence, restraining orders and no-contact orders, were insufficient when dealing with determined abusers. However, as often happens with legislative solutions, the passage of the Tiffany Hill Act was only the beginning of the challenge. Creating a law is one thing, ensuring that it is properly implemented and utilized is another matter entirely. 2 years after the law was passed, investigations revealed that most Washington courts were not utilizing the GPS monitoring option. Despite having this tool available, judges were still primarily relying on traditional approaches like no-contact orders and bail conditions. The technology that could have provided real protection to domestic violence victims was sitting unused. This implementation gap highlighted another layer of the problem. Changing laws is easier than changing culture and practice within the criminal justice system. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys all needed to understand the new options available and be willing to use them appropriately. Training, resources, and cultural shifts within the legal system were all necessary to make the law effective. Clark County, where Tiffany was murdered, became one of the few jurisdictions to actively implement the GPS monitoring program. This was fitting. The community that had failed to protect Tiffany was working to ensure that her death would not be in vain by becoming a model for how the new law could be used effectively. Tiffany's story, while unique in its specific details, reflects broader patterns in domestic violence cases across the United States. Every day, women are killed by current or former intimate partners, and many of these murders occur despite the involvement of the criminal justice system. The most dangerous time for a domestic violence victim is often when they are trying to leave the relationship, exactly the situation Tiffany found herself in. The failure to protect Tiffany also highlights the challenges that domestic violence victims face in getting the system to take their fears seriously. Too often, victims are told to obtain restraining orders as if a piece of paper can stop a determined abuser. When those orders are violated, the response is often inadequate, treating the violations as minor infractions rather than evidence of escalating danger. Tiffany's military background adds another dimension to her story. As a Marine Corps sergeant, she was trained in tactics, threat assessment, and self-protection. Her warnings about the danger Kellen posed should have carried additional weight given her professional expertise. Yet even with her military experience and clear assessment of the threat, the system failed to provide adequate protection. While much of the focus on Tiffany's case has been on the systemic failures and legislative responses, it's important not to lose sight of the most tragic victims, her 3 children. These children lost their mother to violence, witnessed their grandmother being shot, and experienced trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The children were placed in the care of family members after the shooting, but the psychological impact of what they experienced cannot be easily addressed. They will grow up knowing that their father murdered their mother, that they were present when it happened, and that despite multiple warnings and interventions, the system failed to protect their family. Their story represents the intergenerational impact of domestic violence. These children will carry the trauma of that November day with them forever, and they will need ongoing support and services to help them process and heal from what they experienced. The failure to protect Tiffany wasn't just a failure to protect one woman, it was a failure to protect an entire family. The murder of Tiffany Hill represents a convergence of multiple systemic failures. The criminal justice system failed to take the escalating pattern of domestic violence seriously enough. The bail system failed to adequately weigh the danger to victims when making release decisions. The monitoring and enforcement systems failed to prevent repeated violations of protective orders. But perhaps most fundamentally, there was a failure to listen to and believe Tiffany herself. She had intimate knowledge of her abuser, she understood the danger she faced, and she communicated that danger clearly to those in positions to help her. When she said, "He's going to kill me," she was providing expert testimony about her own situation based on years of experience with Kellen's violence and threats. The tendency to discount or minimize the fears of domestic violence victims is a pervasive problem in the criminal justice system. Victims are often seen as unreliable witnesses, as potentially vindictive ex-partners, or as exaggerating the danger they face. This skepticism, while perhaps understandable in other contexts, can be fatal in domestic violence cases where the victim often has the best understanding of the threat they face. Tiffany's murder had effects that extended far beyond her immediate family. The school where she was killed was traumatized, with students, staff, and other parents having to process the fact that such violence had occurred in what should have been a safe space. The first responders who arrived at the scene were affected by what they witnessed. The court personnel who had been involved in the case were forced to confront the consequences of their decisions. The broader Vancouver community was also impacted, forced to confront the reality that domestic violence could escalate to murder even when the system was supposedly providing protection. The murder challenged assumptions about safety and security, and forced community members to think more seriously about the domestic violence occurring in their midst. Domestic violence advocates used Tiffany's case to highlight the inadequacies of existing systems and to push for reforms. Her story became a rallying cry for those seeking to improve protection for domestic violence victims, and her name became associated with efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The murder of Tiffany Hill offers several critical lessons for how society approaches domestic violence. First, it demonstrates the importance of listening to and believing victims when they express fear for their lives. Tiffany's warnings were clear and specific, yet they were not given sufficient weight in the decision-making process that ultimately led to her death. Second, it shows the limitations of traditional protective measures like restraining orders and no-contact orders when dealing with determined abusers. While these tools can be effective in some cases, they are insufficient when the abuser is willing to violate them repeatedly and escalate to violence. Third, it highlights the need for better risk assessment tools and procedures in domestic violence cases. The pattern of escalating violence and repeated violations should have triggered more intensive interventions and protection measures. The criminal justice system needs better ways to identify high-risk cases and respond appropriately. Fourth, it demonstrates the importance of having effective enforcement mechanisms for protective orders. It's not enough to issue orders, there must be swift and meaningful consequences for violations, and victims must be protected when violations occur. Finally, it shows the critical importance of having adequate resources and tools available to protect domestic violence victims. The GPS monitoring that might have saved Tiffany's life existed as technology but wasn't available as a legal option at the time of her case. Even after the Tiffany Hill Act was passed, implementation has been inconsistent, showing that resources and training are necessary to make legal protections effective. Today, Tiffany's memory lives on not just in the hearts of those who loved her, but in the legal protections that bear her name. The Tiffany Hill Act represents a lasting memorial to a woman who fought to protect herself and her children, and whose death sparked efforts to protect others in similar situations. Her story is told in documentaries, news articles, and legislative debates as an example of what can happen when the system fails domestic violence victims. While this exposure serves important advocacy purposes, it's important to remember that behind the policy discussions and legal reforms was a real person, a mother, daughter, and former Marine who deserved protection and didn't receive it. The elementary school parking lot where Tiffany was killed has returned to its normal function, with parents picking up their children and families going about their daily lives. But for those who knew Tiffany and understood what happened there, it remains a reminder of the work still to be done to protect domestic violence victims. Despite the legislative changes inspired by Tiffany's death, domestic violence remains a persistent and deadly problem. Women continue to be killed by intimate partners at alarming rates, and many of these deaths occur despite involvement with the criminal justice system. The challenges that led to Tiffany's death, inadequate risk assessment, insufficient protection measures, and failure to take victim fears seriously, persist in jurisdictions across the country. The underutilization of the Tiffany Hill Act shows that legal reforms alone are not sufficient. Cultural changes within the criminal justice system, adequate funding for domestic violence services, and ongoing training for judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement are all necessary to make meaningful progress in protecting victims. The story of Tiffany Hill also highlights the need for broader social changes in how domestic violence is understood and addressed. While criminal justice interventions are important, they often represent responses to crises rather than prevention of violence. Addressing domestic violence effectively requires education, early intervention, support for healthy relationships, and cultural changes that make violence unacceptable. As we near the end of Tiffany's story, it's important to remember who she was beyond the circumstances of her death. She was a woman who had served her country with honor, who had raised 3 children, and who had fought courageously to protect herself and her family from violence. Her military service speaks to her character. She was someone who was willing to put herself in harm's way to protect others. Her love for her children was evident in everything she did during the final months of her life. Even while living in fear, even while being stalked and threatened, she continued to be their mother. She took them to school, cared for their needs, and tried to maintain some stability in their lives despite the chaos that surrounded them. The fact that she continued to follow legal processes, to work with prosecutors, and to seek protection through proper channels shows her faith in the system even as it was failing her. She didn't take matters into her own hands, didn't flee with her children, didn't resort to violence herself. She believed that the system would protect her if she did everything right, and she paid for that faith with her life. As you settle into sleep tonight, think about Tiffany Hill not as a victim or a statistic, but as a person who faced impossible circumstances with courage and dignity. Her story is tragic, but it's also a story of love, love for her children that motivated her to seek protection, love from her mother who stood by her side, and love from a community that has worked to ensure her death was not in vain. The systemic failures that led to Tiffany's death were real and consequential, but they don't define her story entirely. Her story is also one of service, of motherhood, of courage in the face of danger, and of a legacy that continues to protect others. The Tiffany Hill Act may not have saved her life, but it may save the lives of others, and in that way, her memory continues to serve and protect just as she did in life. In the quiet moments before sleep, remember that behind every true crime story is a real person who lived, loved, hoped, and dreamed. Tiffany Hill was more than the circumstances of her death. She was a full human being whose life had value and meaning beyond the tragedy that ended it. Her children are growing up now, carrying both the trauma of that November day and the love their mother gave them. Her mother continues to advocate for domestic violence victims, turning her grief into action. The community that failed to protect her has learned from that failure and is working to do better. This is how we honor the memory of someone like Tiffany Hill, not just by remembering how she died, but by learning from her death, by working to prevent similar tragedies, and by carrying forward the love and courage she showed in life. In the end, that may be the most fitting memorial of all. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet suburban community of Durbin Crossing in St. Johns County, Florida, the spring of 2021 was meant to bring renewal and celebration. The palm trees swayed gently in the warm Florida breeze, and families were preparing for Mother's Day weekend. But beneath the surface of this peaceful neighborhood, a tragedy was about to unfold that would shatter the innocence of an entire community and leave a family forever changed. Tristan Bailey was the kind of 13-year-old who seemed to carry sunshine wherever she went. With her bright smile and infectious laugh, she was beloved by classmates, teachers, and family alike at Patriot Oaks Academy. As the youngest of 5 children in the Bailey family, Tristan held a special place in everyone's hearts. Her siblings adored her, and her parents, Stacy and Forrest Bailey, couldn't have been prouder of their vibrant daughter. Tristan wasn't just popular because of her outgoing personality. She was a dedicated cheerleader, someone who worked hard at everything she did. Her coaches often spoke about her determination and the way she encouraged her teammates. She had that rare quality that made others feel better just by being around her. In her short 13 years, she had already shown the kind of character that suggested she would grow up to do remarkable things. The Bailey family lived in a comfortable home in Durbin Crossing, a master-planned community known for its safety and family-friendly atmosphere. It was the kind of place where children rode their bikes in the evening, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where parents felt secure letting their teenagers have a bit of independence. The community was close-knit, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes that spoke to the middle-class families who had chosen this corner of Florida to raise their children. The evening of May 8, 2021, started like many others for teenagers in Durbin Crossing. It was a Saturday night, and the weather was perfect for hanging out with friends. Tristan had been spending time with a group of kids from school, including a 14-year-old boy named Aiden Fucci. To most who knew him, Aiden seemed like a typical teenager, but beneath the surface, there were troubling signs that few had recognized. Aiden had been acting differently in recent weeks. Friends would later tell investigators that he had made disturbing comments about wanting to hurt someone, about having violent fantasies. He had spoken about killing someone within 30 days, statements that his peers had dismissed as the kind of dark humor that some teenagers unfortunately engage in. Nobody took these warnings seriously enough to alert adults, a fact that would haunt many people in the aftermath of what was to come. That Saturday evening, a group of teenagers had gathered at a friend's house in the neighborhood. It was the kind of innocent gathering that happens in suburban communities across America every weekend. Kids talking, laughing, maybe watching movies or just enjoying each other's company. But as the night wore on, something shifted in the atmosphere. Around 1 a.m. on May 9th, security cameras in the neighborhood captured footage that would later become crucial evidence. The cameras showed 2 figures walking together down the quiet residential streets of Durbin Crossing. One was Tristan Bailey, recognizable by her small stature and distinctive clothing. The other was Aiden Fucci, taller and walking alongside her as they made their way through the sleeping community. What transpired during those early morning hours would shock investigators with its brutality and senselessness. The 2 teenagers walked toward a wooded area near the retention pond, a place that during daylight hours was peaceful and unremarkable. But in the darkness of that May morning, it would become the scene of an unthinkable crime. Sunday, May 9, 2021, was supposed to be a day of celebration for the Bailey family. Like millions of families across the country, they were preparing to honor Stacy Bailey on Mother's Day. The house should have been filled with the sounds of children getting ready to surprise their mother, perhaps preparing breakfast in bed or gathering for a special meal. Instead, the morning began with growing concern. Tristan's bed was empty, and she wasn't answering her phone. At first, the family hoped for simple explanations. Maybe she had stayed at a friend's house and forgotten to call. Maybe her phone battery had died. In the age of constant communication, a teenager not responding to messages wasn't unusual, but something felt different this time. By 9 a.m., the worry had escalated to genuine fear. The Baileys began making calls to Tristan's friends, trying to piece together where she might be. They learned about the gathering the night before, about the fact that she had been seen walking with Aiden Fucci in the early morning hours. But nobody seemed to know where they had gone or why Tristan hadn't come home. When it became clear that their daughter was truly missing, Forrest and Stacy Bailey made the call that no parent ever wants to make. They contacted the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office to report their 13-year-old daughter missing. What should have been a day of celebration for their family was rapidly becoming their worst nightmare. Sheriff Rob Hardwick and his team responded quickly to the missing person report. In cases involving missing children, time is always of the essence. The first 24 hours are crucial, and with each passing hour, the possibilities become more frightening. Deputies began canvassing the neighborhood immediately, talking to anyone who might have seen Tristan or had information about her whereabouts. As word spread through Durbin Crossing that Tristan Bailey was missing, the community mobilized in a way that spoke to the kind of place it was. Neighbors joined the search, walking through the wooded areas around the retention ponds, calling Tristan's name, hoping against hope that she might simply be lost or injured somewhere nearby. The search took on an urgency as the hours passed. Law enforcement officers were joined by volunteers from the community, people who didn't even know the Bailey family personally but understood that a child was missing and that every minute mattered. They searched through the morning and into the afternoon, their calls echoing through the usually quiet neighborhood. Meanwhile, investigators were working methodically to trace Tristan's last known movements. They reviewed security camera footage from around the community, spoke with the teenagers who had been at the gathering the night before, and tried to construct a timeline of events. The footage showing Tristan and Aiden walking together became a focal point of their investigation. Aiden Fucci was brought in for questioning that afternoon. To investigators, he appeared nervous but not unusually so for a teenager being questioned by police. He told them that he and Tristan had walked together for a while, but that they had eventually parted ways and he had gone home. He claimed he didn't know where she had gone after they separated. But there were inconsistencies in his story, small details that didn't quite add up. More troubling were the reports from other teenagers about the disturbing things Aiden had been saying in recent weeks. The comments about wanting to kill someone, the violent fantasies he had shared with friends, began to take on a more sinister significance in light of Tristan's disappearance. At approximately 6 p.m. on that Mother's Day evening, the worst fears of the Bailey family and the entire community were realized. A searcher discovered a body in a wooded area near the retention pond, not far from where the security cameras had last captured Tristan and Aiden walking together. The scene that investigators encountered was one that would haunt seasoned law enforcement officers for years to come. Tristan Bailey's small body showed signs of an attack so vicious and brutal that it defied comprehension. The preliminary examination revealed that she had suffered 114 stab wounds, with 49 of them being defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating that she had fought desperately for her life. The savagery of the attack spoke to a level of violence that seemed impossible to reconcile with the suburban setting and the young age of both the victim and the suspected perpetrator. This wasn't a crime of passion that had escalated quickly. The sheer number of wounds suggested a sustained and deliberate assault that had continued long after Tristan would have been incapacitated. Even more disturbing were the details that emerged from the crime scene. Someone had written the word "karma" on the inside of Tristan's left ankle and drawn a smiley face on her right ankle. Investigators would never definitively determine who had made these markings, but they added an element of calculated cruelty to an already incomprehensible crime. As news of the discovery spread through Durbin Crossing, the community was plunged into shock and grief. Parents held their children closer, struggling to understand how such violence could occur in their safe neighborhood. The Bailey family, who should have been ending their Mother's Day with happy memories, instead faced the unimaginable reality that their youngest child had been murdered. In the early morning hours of May 10, less than 24 hours after Tristan's body was discovered, deputies arrived at Aiden Fucci's home to place him under arrest. The 14-year-old was initially charged with second-degree murder, but investigators made it clear that the charges could be upgraded as their investigation continued. The arrest of someone so young for such a brutal crime sent shockwaves through the community. Aiden Fucci was not unknown to his neighbors. He was a student at the same school as Tristan, someone who moved in similar social circles. The idea that a 14-year-old could be capable of such violence challenged everyone's assumptions about safety and the nature of evil. As investigators processed the crime scene and began building their case, disturbing details about Aiden's mindset in the weeks leading up to the murder began to emerge. Friends came forward to report the threatening statements he had made, his fascination with violence, and his apparent desire to kill someone. What had once been dismissed as teenage posturing now took on the weight of a confession. The investigation revealed that Aiden had asked for Tristan's phone number on May 8, the day before the murder. This wasn't unusual in itself. Teenagers exchanging contact information was hardly remarkable. But in the context of what followed, it suggested a level of premeditation that made the crime even more chilling. Text messages and social media posts painted a picture of a young person who had been planning violence, who had been building up to this moment for weeks. The spontaneous teenage gathering on Saturday night had provided him with the opportunity he had been seeking. On May 27, 2021, State Attorney R.J. Larrizza announced that prosecutors would be charging Aiden Fucci as an adult with first-degree murder. This decision reflected the premeditated nature of the crime and its extreme brutality. Under Florida law, the death penalty was not an option due to Fucci's age, but he now faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. The decision to charge a 14-year-old as an adult is never made lightly. Prosecutors must consider factors such as the severity of the crime, evidence of premeditation, and the likelihood that the juvenile justice system can adequately address the offense. In this case, the brutal nature of Tristan's murder and the evidence of planning made adult charges appropriate in the eyes of the law. For nearly 2 years, the case made its way through the court system. The Bailey family endured the painful process of seeing their daughter's death dissected in legal proceedings, of learning details about her final moments that no parent should ever have to hear. Throughout it all, they maintained their dignity and their focus on seeking justice for Tristan. Aiden Fucci initially pleaded not guilty to the charges, and his defense team prepared for what would have been a difficult trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own statements to investigators. But as the trial date approached, something shifted in the defense strategy. In February 2023, just as jury selection was about to begin for his trial, Aiden Fucci made a dramatic decision. He changed his plea to guilty for first-degree murder, admitting for the first time that he had killed Tristan Bailey. The plea came as a shock to many who had been following the case, including some members of the Bailey family who had been prepared to endure a trial. The guilty plea meant that there would be no trial, no public examination of the evidence, and no opportunity for the defense to challenge the prosecution's case. Instead, the proceedings moved directly to the sentencing phase, where the focus would be on determining the appropriate punishment for the crime. In his guilty plea, Fucci acknowledged that he had stabbed Tristan Bailey 114 times in the early morning hours of May 9, 2021. He admitted that the murder had been premeditated, that he had planned to kill someone and had chosen Tristan as his victim. The cold calculation behind the crime was finally acknowledged by the perpetrator himself. The medical examiner's report, presented during the sentencing proceedings, revealed the full extent of Tristan's suffering. Dr. Predrag Bulik determined that the cause of death was sharp force trauma, but the number and nature of the wound suggested that the attack had continued long after Tristan could have fought back. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms told the story of a young girl who had tried desperately to save her own life. On March 24, 2023, Aiden Fucci appeared before Circuit Judge R. Lee Smith for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with members of the Bailey family, friends, and community members who had followed the case from the beginning. It was a moment that had been nearly 2 years in the making, a chance for justice to be served and for the community to begin the process of healing. The sentencing hearing included victim impact statements from Tristan's family members, giving them an opportunity to speak directly about how her loss had affected their lives. Her mother, Stacy Bailey, spoke about the daughter she would never see graduate, never see married, never see become a mother herself. Her father, Forrest Bailey, talked about the hole that Tristan's death had left in their family, a void that could never be filled. Tristan's siblings also spoke, sharing memories of their little sister and the impact her loss had on their lives. They talked about her dreams, her plans for the future, and the person she had been becoming before her life was cut short. Their words painted a picture of a young girl who had been loved deeply and who had so much more to give to the world. Judge Smith listened to all of the victim impact statements before pronouncing sentence. He sentenced Aiden Fucci to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under Florida law for someone who had committed murder as a juvenile. The sentence meant that Fucci, who was 16 years old at the time of sentencing, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In pronouncing the sentence, Judge Smith noted the premeditated nature of the crime, its extreme brutality, and the impact it had on the victim, her family, and the community. He acknowledged that no sentence could bring Tristan back or fully heal the wounds that her death had created, but he emphasized that justice required the harshest possible punishment. The sentencing of Aiden Fucci brought a measure of closure to the Bailey family and the Durbin Crossing community, but it could not erase the trauma of what had occurred. A 13-year-old girl who should have been looking forward to high school, to prom dates, to college and career and marriage and children, was gone forever. The case raised difficult questions about warning signs and whether the tragedy could have been prevented. Aiden Fucci's statements about wanting to kill someone, his fascination with violence, and his disturbing behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder had been known to some of his peers. But like many teenagers, they had not taken his words seriously enough to alert adults who might have intervened. Mental health professionals and educators used the case as an example of the importance of taking threats seriously, even when they come from young people who might be dismissed as seeking attention or trying to shock their peers. The tragedy highlighted the need for better communication between teenagers and adults about concerning behavior and the importance of creating environments where young people feel safe reporting troubling statements made by their peers. For the Bailey family, the legal proceedings marked the end of one chapter in their grief journey, but not the end of their pain. They had received justice in the form of a life sentence for their daughter's killer, but justice could not bring Tristan back. They faced the lifelong challenge of learning to live with her absence, of finding ways to honor her memory while moving forward with their own lives. The community of Durbin Crossing also had to grapple with the reality that such violence could occur in their midst. The safe suburban neighborhood where children had once roamed freely became a place where parents thought twice before letting their teenagers walk alone at night. The sense of security that had drawn families to the community had been shattered, replaced by a more cautious awareness of the potential for evil to exist anywhere. In the months and years following Tristan's death, her family and friends found ways to honor her memory and ensure that she would not be forgotten. They established scholarships in her name, supported causes that had been important to her, and worked to keep her spirit alive in the community she had loved. Her cheerleading team dedicated their performances to her memory, carrying on the spirit of encouragement and team unity that Tristan had embodied. Her school held memorial services and created lasting tributes that would remind future students of the bright young woman who had once walked their halls. The tragedy of Tristan Bailey's murder serves as a stark reminder of how quickly and unexpectedly violence can shatter lives and communities. It underscores the preciousness of life and the importance of recognizing and addressing warning signs before they escalate into tragedy. But perhaps most importantly, Tristan's story is not just about how she died, but about how she lived. In her 13 years, she touched countless lives with her kindness, her enthusiasm, and her genuine care for others. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel valued and loved. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a teammate who brought joy wherever she went. The murder of Tristan Bailey continues to resonate beyond the borders of St. Johns County, Florida. The case has been studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals as an example of juvenile violence and the warning signs that might precede such tragedies. It has contributed to ongoing discussions about how society can better identify and intervene with young people who may be at risk of committing violent acts. Educational programs have been developed using the case as an example of the importance of reporting threats and concerning behavior. Schools and communities have implemented new protocols for addressing students who make violent statements, even when those statements might seem like jokes or attempts to gain attention. The case has also highlighted the role of social media and digital communication in modern crimes. Investigators were able to trace text messages, social media posts, and other digital evidence that helped build their case against Aiden Fucci. The digital footprint left by both the victim and perpetrator provided crucial insights into the events leading up to the murder and the mindset of those involved. For other families who have lost children to violence, the Bailey family's journey through grief and the legal system has provided a roadmap of sorts. Their dignity throughout the proceedings, their focus on honoring Tristan's memory, and their advocacy for justice have inspired others facing similar tragedies. The case has also contributed to ongoing debates about how the juvenile justice system should handle extremely violent crimes committed by very young perpetrators. The decision to charge Aiden Fucci as an adult was controversial in some circles, with some arguing that 14-year-olds, regardless of their crimes, should be handled within the juvenile system. Others pointed to the premeditated and brutal nature of Tristan's murder as evidence that adult charges were appropriate. As Aiden Fucci begins serving his life sentence, he will likely spend decades in the Florida prison system. The young man who took Tristan Bailey's life will grow up behind bars, never experiencing the milestones and freedoms that she was denied. He will have opportunities for education, for personal growth, and for reflection on his actions, opportunities that Tristan will never have. The case serves as a sobering reminder that evil can emerge from the most unlikely places, that violence can shatter the peace of even the safest communities, and that the actions of one person can destroy multiple lives in an instant. But it also demonstrates the resilience of families and communities in the face of unimaginable tragedy, and the power of love and memory to transcend even death. As we reflect on the life and death of Tristan Bailey, we are reminded of the fundamental fragility of human existence and the importance of cherishing every moment we have with those we love. Tristan's story is ultimately one of a life cut tragically short, but it is also a story of the impact that one person can have in a brief time on Earth. In her 13 years, Tristan Bailey lived with a fullness and joy that many people never achieve in much longer lifespans. She was genuinely loved by those who knew her, and her death left a void that can never be filled. But her memory continues to inspire others to live with the same kindness, enthusiasm, and care for others that she demonstrated every day. The tragedy that befell the Bailey family on that Mother's Day weekend in 2021 serves as a stark reminder of how quickly life can change, how violence can erupt without warning, and how the actions of one person can ripple outward to affect entire communities. But it also demonstrates the power of love to endure beyond death, the importance of community in times of crisis, and the possibility of finding meaning and purpose even in the midst of unimaginable grief. For those who knew and loved Tristan Bailey, she will always be remembered not as a victim of violence, but as a vibrant young woman who brought light into the world during her brief time here. Her story serves as both a cautionary tale about the capacity for evil that can exist in unexpected places and an inspiration about the power of love, kindness, and community to provide healing and hope in the darkest of times. As we close this account of Tristan's life and death, we are left with the recognition that while justice has been served in the form of her killer's life sentence, true healing comes not from punishment but from remembering, honoring, and carrying forward the best of what she represented. In doing so, we ensure that her life, though tragically short, continues to have meaning and impact long after she is gone. The murder of Tristan Bailey remains one of the most shocking and senseless crimes in recent Florida history, a reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places and destroy lives in an instant. But her story is also one of love, community, and the enduring power of memory to transcend even the most devastating loss. In remembering Tristan Bailey, we honor not just her life, but the values of kindness, joy, and genuine care for others that she embodied every day of her 13 years on Earth. Rest in peace, Tristan Bailey. Your light continues to shine in the hearts of all who knew and loved you, and your memory serves as an eternal reminder of the precious gift of life and the importance of treasuring every moment we have with those we hold dear. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet suburban streets of Irmo, South Carolina, nestled within the upscale Ascot Estates neighborhood, life moved at the gentle pace typical of well-established communities. Tree-lined streets wound past manicured lawns and comfortable homes, where neighbors knew each other by name and children played safely in front yards. It was the kind of place where people moved to escape the chaos of city life, seeking peace and security behind white picket fences and perfectly trimmed hedges. On April 13, 2012, that sense of security would be shattered forever when two lives were violently cut short in what would become one of South Carolina's most complex and troubling murder cases. The victims were Tammy Jo Parker, a 44-year-old wife and mother, and Brian Kapnerhurst, a 46-year-old businessman. Both would die in the Parker family home, and the man responsible for their deaths would claim he was acting in self-defense. But as investigators would soon discover, the truth behind these murders was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Tammy Jo Parker lived what appeared to be a comfortable middle-class life with her husband Brett in their Ascot Estates home. At 44, she had the kind of warm, approachable appearance that made her popular among neighbors and friends. Those who knew her described her as devoted to her family, someone who took pride in creating a welcoming home environment. She had no idea that her marriage was built on a foundation of lies, deception, and dangerous financial dealings that would ultimately cost her everything. Her husband, Brett Parker, presented himself as a successful businessman to the outside world. Clean-cut and charming, he seemed to embody the image of suburban prosperity. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked a man living a double life. Brett was deeply involved in illegal sports betting operations, working as a bookie in a sophisticated gambling ring that extended far beyond the peaceful borders of their quiet neighborhood. What made Brett's situation particularly dangerous was not just his involvement in illegal gambling, but the mounting debts that were beginning to consume him. Then there was Brian Kapnerhurst, a 46-year-old man who had become entangled in Brett's web of illegal activities. Brian wasn't just a casual acquaintance or distant business associate, he was Brett's partner in the underground gambling operation. The two men had worked together for months, taking bets and managing the complex financial arrangements that kept their illegal enterprise running. Brian had his own family to worry about, including his wife Cindy, who would later testify about the financial pressures and mounting debts that had begun to plague their household. What none of these individuals could have foreseen was how their interconnected relationships would create a perfect storm of desperation, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. As winter gave way to spring in 2012, Brett Parker's carefully maintained double life was beginning to crumble. The illegal gambling operation that had once seemed like a path to easy money was now threatening to destroy everything he had built. Court records would later reveal that Brett owed approximately $175,000 to various parties connected to the gambling ring, a staggering amount that represented far more than just pocket change. This wasn't the kind of debt that could be ignored or paid off gradually. In the world of illegal gambling, substantial unpaid debts carried serious consequences. The pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Brett's gambling associates were growing impatient with his inability to settle his accounts. The sophisticated betting operation that had once made him feel important and connected to something larger than his suburban existence was now a source of constant anxiety and fear. Every phone call could be a demand for payment. Every unexpected visitor might be someone coming to collect what he owed. But Brett's financial troubles were only part of his growing problems. His marriage to Tammy Jo was also showing signs of strain, though she remained largely unaware of the true extent of her husband's illegal activities. Brett had been conducting an extramarital affair with a woman named Lindsay Mullins, adding another layer of deception to his already complicated life. The emotional and financial pressures of maintaining his various lies were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Meanwhile, Brian Kapnerhurst was dealing with his own set of problems related to their gambling operation. His wife Cindy would later testify during Brett's trial about the mounting financial pressures their family was facing. The illegal betting business that had initially promised easy profits was now creating more problems than it solved. Both men found themselves trapped in a situation that was spiraling beyond their control. As April 2012 progressed, something had to give. The question was what form that breaking point would take, and who would pay the ultimate price when Brett Parker's world finally collapsed around him. April 13, 2012, dawned like any other spring day in the quiet Ascot Estates neighborhood. Residents went about their morning routines, unaware that before the day was over, their sense of security would be forever altered. The events that would unfold in the Parker household that day would later be reconstructed through police investigation, forensic evidence, and conflicting testimony, but the basic facts would prove both shocking and tragic. According to the narrative that Brett Parker would later provide to police, Brian Kapnerhurst had come to his home that day for what was supposed to be a routine business meeting. The two men often met to discuss their gambling operations, settle accounts, and plan their next moves in the complex world of illegal sports betting. These meetings were typically conducted in the privacy of Brett's home, away from prying eyes and potential surveillance. But something was different about this particular meeting. The financial pressures that had been building for months had reached a critical point. The debts that Brett owed weren't going away, and his creditors were becoming increasingly aggressive in their demands for payment. The comfortable suburban lifestyle that he had worked so hard to maintain was under serious threat. What happened next would become the subject of intense legal debate and forensic analysis. According to Brett's initial statement to police, the meeting with Brian took a violent turn. He claimed that Brian had become aggressive and threatening, eventually pulling out a weapon. In the chaos that followed, Brett alleged that Brian had shot and killed Tammy Jo before Brett was forced to defend himself by shooting Brian. This version of events painted Brett as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, a husband who had been forced to watch his wife die before taking desperate action to save his own life. It was a narrative that, if believed, would cast him as a tragic figure rather than a perpetrator. But as investigators began to examine the evidence more closely, serious questions would emerge about the truthfulness of Brett's account. When police arrived at the Parker home in the affluent Ascot Estates neighborhood, they found a scene that was both horrific and puzzling. Two people were dead from gunshot wounds, Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst. Brett Parker was alive and appeared to be in shock, telling officers that he had been forced to defend himself after Brian had killed his wife in what he described as a robbery gone wrong. The initial response from first responders was to treat Brett as a surviving victim of a violent crime. He was taken to the hospital for evaluation and treatment of minor injuries that he claimed to have sustained during the struggle with Brian. His emotional state appeared consistent with someone who had just witnessed his wife's murder and been forced to take a life in self-defense. But even in those first crucial hours, experienced investigators began to notice details that didn't quite align with Brett's version of events. The positioning of the bodies, the trajectory of the bullets, and the overall scene suggested a more complex sequence of events than the simple home invasion and self-defense scenario that Brett had described. Richland County Sheriff's Department detectives began the painstaking process of documenting and analyzing every aspect of the crime scene. They photographed the positioning of the victims, collected ballistics evidence, and searched for signs of forced entry or struggle that would support Brett's account of a robbery attempt. What they found instead was evidence that would gradually paint a very different picture of what had happened in the Parker home that day. As the investigation progressed, detectives learned about Brett's involvement in the illegal gambling operation. This discovery opened up entirely new avenues of inquiry and provided potential motives that went far beyond a simple robbery. The financial pressures that Brett was facing, combined with his extramarital affair and the complex web of debts and obligations surrounding the gambling ring, created a much more complicated backdrop to the murders. Forensic experts began analyzing the physical evidence from the scene, including ballistics reports that would prove crucial in determining the sequence of events. The positioning of shell casings, blood spatter patterns, and other physical evidence would tell a story that differed significantly from Brett's initial claims of self-defense. As investigators delved deeper into the lives of everyone involved in the April 13th murders, a complex web of secrets and lies began to emerge. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of self-defense during a robbery attempt was revealing itself to be something far more sinister and premeditated. The illegal gambling operation that connected Brett Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst was more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Court documents would later reveal that this wasn't a small-time betting operation between friends, but rather a sophisticated network that handled substantial amounts of money and involved multiple participants across the region. Brett's role as a bookie had put him in contact with serious criminals who didn't take kindly to unpaid debts. The $175,000 that Brett owed to various parties in the gambling ring represented more than just a financial burden, it was a potential death sentence in the underground world he had chosen to enter. People in these circles had been known to use violence to collect debts, and Brett would have been acutely aware of the dangers he faced if he couldn't find a way to satisfy his creditors. But investigators also uncovered another crucial piece of the puzzle: life insurance policies. Tammy Jo Parker's life was insured for more than $1 million, with Brett as the primary beneficiary. This discovery provided a potential financial motive that went far beyond simply eliminating a business partner who might have been causing problems. If Brett could successfully claim that his wife had been murdered during a robbery, he would not only eliminate his gambling debts but also gain access to a substantial insurance payout. The affair with Lindsay Mullins added yet another layer to Brett's potential motives. During the trial, prosecutors would argue that Brett wanted out of his marriage to Tammy Jo but didn't want to face the financial consequences of a divorce. By arranging her death in what appeared to be a home invasion, he could eliminate both his marital obligations and his gambling debts while positioning himself as a grieving widower deserving of sympathy rather than suspicion. Phone records and witness testimony would later reveal that Brett had been in contact with Lindsay Mullins on the day of the murders, even having sexual relations with her shortly before the killings occurred. This timeline would prove crucial in establishing Brett's state of mind and his ability to carry out a premeditated plan while maintaining the appearance of normal behavior. As months passed and the investigation continued, prosecutors began building a case that painted Brett Parker not as a victim of circumstances, but as a cold-blooded killer who had carefully orchestrated the murders of both his wife and business partner. The evidence they assembled would challenge every aspect of Brett's self-defense narrative and present an alternative theory that was both chilling and persuasive. The forensic evidence proved particularly damaging to Brett's version of events. Ballistics experts determined that the positioning of the victims and the trajectory of the bullets were inconsistent with Brett's claim that Brian had shot Tammy Jo before Brett was forced to defend himself. The physical evidence suggested that both victims had been shot by the same person, and that person was Brett Parker. Blood spatter analysis provided additional contradictions to Brett's story. The patterns of blood at the scene indicated that the victims had been shot from specific positions that didn't align with the chaotic struggle that Brett had described. Instead, the evidence suggested a more controlled situation in which both victims had been systematically executed. Prosecutors theorized that Brett had lured Brian to his home under the pretense of discussing their gambling business, but with the actual intention of killing both Brian and his wife Tammy Jo. The plan, according to this theory, was to make it appear that Brian had killed Tammy Jo during a robbery attempt before Brett killed Brian in self-defense. This would eliminate Brett's business partner, who might have been pressuring him about gambling debts, while also providing access to Tammy Jo's life insurance money. The insurance angle proved particularly compelling to prosecutors. More than $1 million in coverage on Tammy Joe's life would have been more than enough to pay off Brett's gambling debts and provide him with a fresh start. The timing of the murders, coming at a point when Brett's financial pressures were at their peak, seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Witness testimony from Lindsay Mullins, Brett's mistress, provided insight into his state of mind in the days leading up to the murders. She would testify about Brett's behavior and communications, painting a picture of a man who was feeling increasingly desperate about his financial situation and the various pressures in his life. The prosecution's case also highlighted Brett's behavior in the immediate aftermath of the murders. Rather than showing the kind of profound grief and trauma that would be expected from someone who had just watched his wife die and been forced to kill in self-defense, Brett's actions and demeanor suggested someone who was following a predetermined script. When Brett Parker's murder trial began, it attracted significant attention from both local media and true crime enthusiasts who were fascinated by the complex web of gambling, adultery, and murder that had unfolded in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The courtroom proceedings would reveal details about the case that had not been previously disclosed to the public, painting an even more disturbing picture of premeditation and cold-blooded calculation. Prosecutors presented their case methodically, building layer upon layer of evidence that contradicted Brett's self-defense claims. The forensic evidence was particularly damaging, with experts testifying about ballistics, blood spatter patterns, and other physical evidence that told a story very different from the one Brett had provided to police. Cindy Kapnerhurst, Brian's widow, provided emotional testimony about the financial pressures that had been affecting her husband in the months leading up to his death. Her account helped establish the context of mounting debts and increasing desperation that had characterized the gambling operation in which both Brett and Brian had been involved. The defense team faced an uphill battle in trying to maintain Brett's self-defense narrative in the face of overwhelming physical evidence to the contrary. They argued that the forensic analysis was flawed and that Brett had indeed been forced to act in self-defense when Brian became violent and killed Tammy Joe. However, their arguments failed to explain away the numerous inconsistencies between Brett's account and the physical evidence at the scene. Lindsay Mullins' testimony proved particularly damaging to Brett's case. Her account of their relationship and Brett's behavior in the days surrounding the murders provided prosecutors with evidence of Brett's state of mind and his ability to compartmentalize his actions while maintaining relationships with multiple women simultaneously. The insurance evidence was presented as a crucial component of Brett's motive. Prosecutors argued that the more than $1 million in life insurance coverage on Tammy Joe's life provided Brett with a clear financial incentive to arrange her death in a way that would not raise suspicions about his involvement. Throughout the trial, Brett maintained his innocence and stuck to his story about acting in self-defense. However, the accumulation of evidence against him proved overwhelming. The jury would ultimately have to decide whether to believe Brett's version of events or the alternative narrative presented by prosecutors and supported by extensive forensic evidence. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict in Brett Parker's double murder trial. The speed of their decision-making process suggested that they had found the prosecution's case compelling and had little difficulty rejecting Brett's self-defense claims. When the verdicts were read, Brett Parker was found guilty on 2 counts of murder in the deaths of his wife Tammy Joe Parker and his business partner Brian Kapnerhurst. Judge DeAndrea Benjamin sentenced Brett to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison for his crimes. During the sentencing, the judge expressed hope that Brett would use his time in prison to reflect on the devastating consequences of his actions and the lives that had been destroyed by his choices. The impact of Brett's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims. Tammy Joe's family had lost a beloved daughter, sister, and mother whose life had been cut short by the man who had promised to love and protect her. Brian's widow Cindy was left to deal not only with the grief of losing her husband but also with the financial and emotional aftermath of his involvement in the illegal gambling operation. The case also had broader implications for the community of Irmo and the Ascot Estates neighborhood. The murders shattered the sense of security that residents had long taken for granted, serving as a reminder that even the most peaceful suburban communities were not immune to violence and tragedy. For law enforcement, the case demonstrated the importance of thorough forensic investigation in challenging false narratives and uncovering the truth behind complex crimes. The physical evidence had been crucial in disproving Brett's self-defense claims and establishing the premeditated nature of the murders. The gambling angle of the case also highlighted the dangerous consequences of involvement in illegal activities. What had started as what might have seemed like easy money through sports betting had ultimately led to mounting debts, desperate circumstances, and violent crime. The case served as a cautionary tale about the risks associated with underground gambling operations and the criminal elements that often surround such activities. The Brett Parker case would continue to generate interest and discussion long after the trial concluded and the sentences were handed down. The case was featured on various true crime television programs, including Dateline NBC's Mystery at Ascot Estates, which provided a detailed examination of the investigation and trial proceedings for a national audience. The complexity of the case, with its elements of illegal gambling, adultery, insurance fraud, and cold-blooded murder, made it a compelling subject for true crime enthusiasts and legal analysts. The way in which Brett had attempted to manipulate the circumstances to appear as a victim rather than a perpetrator highlighted the sophisticated planning that had gone into the murders. For the families of the victims, the conclusion of the trial provided some measure of closure, but it could never restore the lives that had been lost or undo the trauma that Brett's actions had caused. Tammy Jo Parker's family had to come to terms with the fact that the man she had trusted and loved had been the one responsible for her death. Brian Kapnerhurst's family faced similar challenges in processing the betrayal by someone who had been his business partner and friend. The case also had implications for insurance companies and their investigation procedures. The attempted insurance fraud aspect of the case demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation when substantial claims are made in circumstances involving violent death. Insurance investigators would likely use this case as an example of the red flags that should trigger additional scrutiny of claims. From a legal perspective, the case provided an example of how forensic evidence could be used to challenge and ultimately disprove false narratives about self-defense. The careful analysis of ballistics, blood spatter patterns, and other physical evidence had been crucial in establishing the truth about what had happened in the Parker home on that April day in 2012. The case also served as a reminder of the ripple effects that criminal activity can have on families and communities. Brett's involvement in illegal gambling had not only led to his own downfall but had also resulted in the deaths of 2 innocent people and the destruction of multiple families. As we consider the case of Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst, we're confronted with a story that encompasses many of the darkest aspects of human nature: greed, betrayal, deception, and the willingness to commit murder for financial gain. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the premeditated nature of the crimes and the cold calculation that Brett Parker displayed in planning and executing the murders of 2 people who trusted him. The transformation of Brett Parker from a seemingly respectable suburban husband and businessman into a cold-blooded killer serves as a reminder of how financial pressure and moral corruption can lead individuals down paths they might never have imagined possible. His involvement in illegal gambling had started as what probably seemed like a relatively minor transgression, but it had ultimately led to a spiral of debt, desperation, and violence that destroyed multiple lives. The case also highlights the vulnerability of those who become entangled with individuals involved in criminal activities. Tammy Jo Parker had no way of knowing that her husband's illegal activities would ultimately cost her life. Brian Kapnerhurst had entered into a business partnership that seemed profitable but had no way of anticipating that his partner would eventually see him as an obstacle to be eliminated. The sophisticated nature of Brett's plan, attempting to make the murders appear to be the result of a robbery gone wrong while positioning himself as a victim and survivor, demonstrates a level of premeditation and cunning that makes the crimes even more chilling. The fact that he came so close to succeeding in his deception serves as a testament to the importance of thorough criminal investigation and forensic analysis. The insurance fraud component of the case adds another layer of calculation to Brett's crimes. The more than $1 million in life insurance coverage on his wife's life provided not just a motive for murder but also a means of solving his financial problems while eliminating his marital obligations. The coldness required to plan and execute such a scheme while maintaining the appearance of a loving husband is difficult to comprehend. For those who study criminal behavior, the Brett Parker case provides insights into the psychology of individuals who are willing to commit murder for financial gain. The ability to compartmentalize his actions while continuing to maintain relationships with his wife, his mistress, and his business partner suggests a level of psychological manipulation and emotional detachment that is characteristic of the most dangerous types of criminals. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of being aware of the people we trust and the activities they may be involved in without our knowledge. While most people live their lives without encountering the kind of violence and deception that characterized this case, the story serves as a cautionary tale about the potential consequences of becoming involved with individuals who operate outside the law. As we reach the end of this tragic tale, we're left with the sobering reality that two innocent people lost their lives because of one man's greed, desperation, and willingness to use violence to solve his problems. Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst were both victims of Brett Parker's calculated decision to commit murder rather than face the consequences of his poor choices and illegal activities. The case of the murders of Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most ordinary on the surface. Brett Parker's ability to maintain his facade as a respectable suburban husband while planning and executing a double murder demonstrates how deceptive appearances can be and how important it is for law enforcement to look beyond initial impressions when investigating serious crimes. The thorough investigation conducted by the Richland County Sheriff's Department and the careful forensic analysis that ultimately proved Brett's guilt serve as examples of how modern criminal investigation techniques can uncover the truth even when perpetrators have gone to great lengths to conceal their crimes. Without this careful work, Brett Parker might have succeeded in his attempt to collect insurance money while avoiding responsibility for his actions. For the families of the victims, the conclusion of the case provided justice but could never fully heal the wounds caused by their losses. The knowledge that Brett Parker will spend the rest of his life in prison may provide some comfort, but it cannot restore the lives that were taken or undo the trauma that his actions caused. As we consider this case, we're reminded of the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences that can result when individuals choose violence as a solution to their problems. The deaths of Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst serve as a tragic reminder of how quickly lives can be destroyed by the actions of those who prioritize their own interests above all else. In the quiet neighborhood of Ascot Estates, life has gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of what happened there on April 13, 2012, serves as a permanent reminder that evil can lurk behind even the most ordinary facades. The case stands as a testament to the importance of justice, the dedication of law enforcement professionals, and the resilience of communities in the face of unspeakable tragedy. The story of Brett Parker's crimes will continue to serve as a case study for law enforcement professionals, legal scholars, and anyone interested in understanding the complex factors that can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence. It remains a sobering reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within the human heart and the importance of the systems we have in place to seek justice for victims and hold perpetrators accountable for their actions. And so, in the end, justice was served, but at a cost that no amount of legal satisfaction can ever fully address. 2 lives were lost, families were destroyed, and a community was forever changed by the actions of one man who chose murder over accountability, deception over truth, and self-interest over the lives of those who trusted him most. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. In the heart of Zambia's vast wilderness, where the African sun rises over endless savannas and the sounds of exotic wildlife echo through the morning air, a tragedy unfolded that would expose decades of deception, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. This is the story of Bianca Rudolph, a 56-year-old mother of 2, whose final hunting expedition would become her last moments on Earth. The year was 2016, and autumn had settled over Pennsylvania when Larry and Bianca Rudolph made their final preparations for what had become an annual tradition. For years, the successful couple had embarked on hunting safaris across Africa, drawn by the thrill of big game hunting and the adventure that came with exploring some of the world's most remote locations. Larry, a prosperous dentist who had built a thriving practice called Three Rivers Dental Group in the Pittsburgh area, could afford such luxuries. His wife Bianca, a devoted mother and adventurous spirit, had embraced this passion alongside him. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life lay secrets that would soon come to light in the most devastating way possible. Lawrence "Larry" Rudolph was not just a successful businessman, he was a man living a double life. For years, while maintaining the facade of a loving husband and father, he had been conducting an affair with Lori Milleron, a woman who worked closely with his dental practice. This wasn't a brief indiscretion or a moment of weakness, it was a long-term relationship that had been carefully hidden from Bianca and their two children, Julian and Anna Bianca. As October 2016 approached, the Rudolphs prepared for what they believed would be another exciting hunting adventure in Zambia. They had made this journey before, familiar with the rhythms of life in the African bush, the early morning wake-up calls, the patient waiting in blinds, and the careful preparation of firearms and equipment. Bianca, an experienced hunter in her own right, was comfortable handling the various rifles and shotguns that were essential tools of their safari expeditions. The couple arrived in Zambia in late September, settling into the remote hunting camp that would serve as their base for the next 2 weeks. The accommodation was basic but functional, small wooden cabins scattered throughout the preserve, each providing the essential comforts needed for hunters who spent their days tracking game across the African landscape. Their cabin was modest, with simple furnishings and just enough space for their equipment, clothing, and the trophies they hoped to collect. For 13 days, the Rudolphs pursued their quarry across the Zambian wilderness. Bianca proved herself to be a skilled hunter, successfully taking down a zebra during their stay. However, the prize they both sought, a leopard, remained elusive. The Zambian government had recently lifted its ban on leopard hunting for that season, making these magnificent cats a particularly coveted trophy for wealthy hunters from around the world. Day after day, they set out with high hopes, only to return to their cabin empty-handed in their quest for the elusive leopard. October 11, 2016, dawned like any other morning in the African bush. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, while the sounds of awakening wildlife filled the air. It was their final day at the camp, and the couple was preparing to pack their belongings and equipment for the journey home to Pennsylvania. According to Larry's account of the events that morning, he had been in the small bathroom of their cabin when he heard a sudden, devastating gunshot. The sound echoed through the thin walls of the wooden structure, followed by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. When he emerged from the bathroom, he claimed, he found his wife of 34 years lying on the floor of their cabin, a fatal wound to her chest. Bianca Rudolph had been shot once in the heart with a 12-gauge shotgun, a weapon she had been using throughout their hunting expedition. The scene that greeted Larry was every hunter's worst nightmare. His wife lay motionless, the victim of what appeared to be a tragic accident with her own firearm. Larry's explanation was straightforward and, on the surface, entirely plausible. He told the camp staff and local authorities that Bianca had been in the process of packing away her shotgun when it discharged accidentally. Anyone familiar with firearms knows that such accidents, while rare, can and do occur. Hunters spend countless hours handling loaded weapons, and even the most experienced can fall victim to a moment of carelessness or equipment malfunction. The local Zambian police arrived at the scene and conducted their investigation. They examined the cabin, spoke with witnesses, and reviewed the physical evidence. Based on their findings and Larry's account of the events, they officially ruled Bianca's death as accidental. To them, this appeared to be nothing more than a tragic end to what should have been a memorable hunting expedition. With the official determination made, Larry Rudolph was free to return to the United States with his wife's body. The couple's 2 adult children, Julian and Anna Bianca, were devastated by the news of their mother's sudden death. They had no reason to question their father's account of the accident. After all, they knew their parents were experienced hunters, but they also understood that accidents could happen to anyone, regardless of experience level. The funeral arrangements were made, and Bianca was laid to rest while family and friends mourned the loss of a vibrant woman who had died far too young. Larry appeared to be a grieving widower, struggling to cope with the sudden loss of his life partner. Those close to the family offered their condolences and support during what everyone believed was an incredibly difficult time. But Larry Rudolph's grief, it would later be discovered, was not as genuine as it appeared. In fact, within a remarkably short time after his wife's death, his behavior began to raise eyebrows among those who knew the family well. The first red flag came when Larry made the decision to move Lori Milleron, his longtime mistress, into the family home. This wasn't a gradual development or something that happened months later. It occurred with what many considered unseemly haste for a man who had supposedly just lost the love of his life in a tragic accident. But perhaps even more telling was Larry's swift action regarding Bianca's life insurance policies. Unknown to most people, including possibly Bianca herself, Larry had taken out an extensive collection of life insurance policies on his wife. These weren't modest policies designed to cover funeral expenses or provide basic financial security for the family. Instead, they represented a staggering amount of coverage that would make Larry a very wealthy man in the event of his wife's death. Within weeks of Bianca's funeral, Larry began the process of filing claims on not one, not two, but 9 separate life insurance policies from 7 different companies. The total value of these policies was approximately $4.9 million, a sum that would allow someone to live very comfortably for the rest of their life. The insurance companies, as is their standard practice when dealing with large claims, began their own investigations into Bianca's death. While they initially processed the claims based on the official determination by Zambian authorities that the death was accidental, some aspects of the case began to trouble investigators. Meanwhile, Larry's children were struggling with their own doubts and suspicions. Julian and Anna Bianca had initially accepted their father's account of their mother's death, but as time passed and they observed his behavior, questions began to emerge. The speed with which he had moved his girlfriend into their family home, combined with his apparent lack of profound grief, struck them as inconsistent with the behavior of a man who had just lost his beloved wife in a tragic accident. It was Julian who ultimately took the step that would change everything. Despite the emotional difficulty of challenging his own father, he reached out to the FBI with his concerns about his mother's death. This decision couldn't have been easy for a son who was already dealing with the loss of his mother, but Julian felt compelled to seek answers to the questions that had been haunting him. The FBI's involvement marked the beginning of a much more thorough investigation into Bianca Rudolph's death. Federal agents have resources and expertise that far exceed those of local police forces, particularly in cases involving crimes that occur overseas. They began to carefully examine every aspect of the case, from the physical evidence at the scene in Zambia to Larry's financial records and personal relationships. One of the first things that drew the FBI's attention was the sheer number and value of the life insurance policies. While it's not unusual for a successful professional to carry life insurance, the extent of coverage Larry had purchased on his wife was extraordinary. Investigators began to dig deeper into when these policies were purchased, how the premiums were paid, and whether Bianca was fully aware of the extent of her coverage. The investigation also focused on Larry's relationship with Lori Milleron. Agents interviewed people who knew both Larry and Lori, trying to establish the timeline and nature of their relationship. What they discovered was that this wasn't a recent development or something that had begun after Bianca's death. Instead, it was a long-term affair that had been carefully concealed from Bianca and the couple's children. As the investigation progressed, the FBI began to develop a theory about what had really happened in that cabin in Zambia on the morning of October 11, 2016. They believed that Larry had not been in the bathroom when the gun went off, as he claimed. Instead, they theorized that he had deliberately shot his wife with the intention of making it appear to be an accident. The motive, according to investigators, was twofold. First, there was the substantial financial gain from Bianca's life insurance policies, nearly $5 million that would allow Larry to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Second, there was his desire to be free to pursue his relationship with Lori Milleron without the complications of divorce proceedings, which could have been financially devastating and emotionally traumatic for everyone involved. In March 2021, nearly 5 years after Bianca's death, Larry Rudolph was arrested and charged with murder. The charges were serious: murder of a U.S. national in a foreign country and mail fraud related to his insurance claims. Lori Milleron was also arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact to murder, accused of helping Larry cover up his crime. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Pittsburgh area, where Larry had been a respected member of the community. Patients who had trusted him with their dental care, colleagues who had worked alongside him, and friends who had socialized with the couple struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the accusations being made against him. Larry maintained his innocence throughout the legal proceedings. His defense team argued that Bianca's death was indeed a tragic accident, just as the Zambian authorities had originally determined. They pointed to the fact that there were no eyewitnesses to the shooting and that the physical evidence could be interpreted in multiple ways. However, the prosecution had built a compelling case that went far beyond the physical evidence from the scene. They presented testimony about Larry's affair with Lori Milleron, the extensive life insurance policies he had purchased on his wife, and his behavior in the aftermath of Bianca's death. They also brought in expert witnesses who challenged Larry's version of how the shooting had occurred. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was the ballistics analysis of the shotgun and the wound it had caused. Experts testified that the angle and nature of the wound were inconsistent with an accidental discharge while Bianca was packing the weapon. Instead, they suggested that the evidence was more consistent with the gun being fired at close range while pointed directly at Bianca's chest. The trial also revealed disturbing details about Larry's financial motivations. Prosecutors showed that he had been methodical in purchasing the various life insurance policies over a period of years, always ensuring that the coverage amounts were substantial but not so large as to raise immediate suspicions. The timing of some policy purchases and premium payments also raised questions about his long-term intentions. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the testimony from Julian and Anna Bianca Rudolph, who had to publicly discuss their suspicions about their own father. The emotional toll of losing their mother and then discovering that their father might have been responsible for her death was evident as they testified about the inconsistencies they had observed in his behavior and story. The prosecution also presented evidence about Larry's relationship with Lori Milleron, showing that it was far more serious and long-standing than he had initially claimed. Phone records, financial documents, and witness testimony painted a picture of a man who had been living a double life for years, maintaining his marriage to Bianca while simultaneously planning a future with his mistress. On August 1, 2022, after careful deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Larry Rudolph was found guilty on all charges: murder of a U.S. national in a foreign country and mail fraud. The conviction meant that he faced the possibility of life in prison. Lori Milleron was also convicted on charges of being an accessory after the fact to murder. The jury found that she had knowingly helped Larry cover up his crime and had lied to federal investigators during their investigation. The sentencing phase of the case provided an opportunity for Bianca's family and friends to speak about the impact of her loss. Through victim impact statements, they painted a picture of a woman who had been a devoted mother, a loyal friend, and someone who had trusted her husband completely. The contrast between the life Bianca had lived and the way it had ended was stark and heartbreaking. On August 22, 2023, Larry Rudolph received his sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted the premeditated nature of the crime and the betrayal of trust that it represented. In addition to the life sentence, Larry was ordered to pay more than $15 million in penalties and restitution. The case had taken more than 6 years to resolve, from the morning Bianca died in that remote cabin in Zambia to the day her husband was finally held accountable for her murder. During that time, her family had endured not only the loss of a beloved wife and mother but also the gradual, painful realization that the person they had trusted most had been responsible for her death. For Julian and Anna Bianca Rudolph, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but it could never restore their mother or undo the trauma of discovering their father's betrayal. They had lost both parents in a sense, one to murder and the other to a life sentence in federal prison. The case also highlighted the complexities of investigating crimes that occur in foreign countries. If not for Julian's courage in contacting the FBI with his suspicions, Larry Rudolph might have succeeded in his plan to commit the perfect murder. The initial investigation by Zambian authorities, while conducted in good faith, lacked the resources and expertise needed to uncover the truth about what had really happened in that cabin. The murder of Bianca Rudolph serves as a reminder that domestic violence and intimate partner murder can affect anyone, regardless of their social status, financial success, or apparent happiness. From the outside, the Rudolphs appeared to be a successful, adventurous couple who shared a passion for travel and hunting. The reality was far different, a marriage that had become a facade for one partner while the other remained unaware of the danger she faced. The case also demonstrates the importance of comprehensive life insurance fraud investigations. Larry's methodical approach to purchasing multiple policies from different companies was designed to avoid detection, but ultimately, it became one of the key pieces of evidence that led to his conviction. The nearly $5 million in coverage he had purchased on his wife was far beyond what would be considered normal for someone in their circumstances. Today, Larry Rudolph sits in a federal prison, serving a life sentence for the murder of his wife. At 68 years old at the time of his sentencing, he will likely spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Lori Milleron also received a significant sentence for her role in helping to cover up the crime. The hunting camp in Zambia where Bianca died continues to operate, hosting other hunters who come to experience the thrill of African big game hunting. The small wooden cabin where she spent her final moments stands as a silent witness to a crime that took years to solve and a family that was destroyed by greed and betrayal. Bianca's children have had to rebuild their lives while carrying the knowledge of how their mother really died. They have shown remarkable strength in pursuing justice for her, even when it meant testifying against their own father. Their courage in coming forward with their suspicions was crucial to ensuring that Larry Rudolph was ultimately held accountable for his actions. The case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries and television programs, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that wealth and status protect people from becoming victims of domestic violence. It has also highlighted the importance of listening to family members who express concerns about suspicious deaths, even when those concerns involve accusations against people who seem above suspicion. For those who knew Bianca Rudolph personally, her memory lives on not as a victim but as the vibrant, adventurous woman she was during her 56 years of life. She was someone who embraced new experiences, loved her children deeply, and trusted her husband completely, a trust that he ultimately betrayed in the most devastating way possible. The African savanna where Bianca spent her final days continues its ancient rhythms, with the sun rising and setting over landscapes that have witnessed countless stories of life and death over the millennia. But for one family from Pennsylvania, those beautiful, remote plains will forever be associated with loss, betrayal, and the long journey toward justice. As we reflect on this case, we're reminded that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved through the dedication of investigators, the courage of family members who refuse to accept easy answers, and a legal system that, despite its imperfections, can still hold people accountable for their actions, no matter how carefully they believe they have planned and executed their crimes. The murder of Bianca Rudolph was not a spur-of-the-moment act of violence, but rather the culmination of years of deception and planning. It represents a profound betrayal of the trust that forms the foundation of marriage and family relationships. While Larry Rudolph may have believed he had committed the perfect crime in a remote location where he thought he could control the narrative, the truth eventually emerged, as it so often does in cases where families refuse to give up their search for answers. In the end, Bianca Rudolph's story is one of a life cut short by someone she trusted completely, but it's also a story of family members who refused to let her death go unavenged and investigators who worked tirelessly to ensure that justice was ultimately served. Her memory serves as a reminder that every life has value and that no one has the right to end another person's life for personal gain, no matter how carefully they believe they can conceal their crime. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet suburban streets of Mishawaka, Indiana, where tree-lined neighborhoods stretch beneath endless Midwest skies, December 2018 began like any other winter month. Christmas lights twinkled in windows, families prepared for the holidays, and high school students looked forward to winter break. But beneath this peaceful facade, a darkness was brewing that would shatter the illusion of safety forever. This is the story of Brianna Rousalong, a 17-year-old cheerleader whose bright future was cut tragically short by someone she trusted. It's a story that reveals how quickly young lives can spiral into unthinkable violence, and how the pressures of adolescence can sometimes lead to devastating consequences. Brianna Nicole Rousalong was the kind of teenager that adults often describe as having an old soul. Born and raised in Mishawaka, a small city nestled in northern Indiana near the Michigan border, she had spent her entire life in this close-knit community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Her friends and family would later describe her as someone who possessed a natural warmth, the type of person who could walk into any room and immediately make others feel at ease. At Mishawaka High School, Brianna was a familiar face in the hallways. She carried herself with the confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin, yet she remained humble and kind to classmates regardless of their social standing. Her infectious smile became something of a trademark, lighting up football games where she cheered on the sidelines, her voice carrying across the stadium as she led crowds in spirited chants. But Brianna wasn't just a cheerleader. She was also a dedicated softball player, spending countless hours on diamond fields throughout Indiana, perfecting her swing and learning the value of teamwork. Those who knew her best understood that beneath her athletic achievements lay a young woman with genuine academic ambitions. She maintained solid grades while balancing her extracurricular activities, and most importantly, she had begun receiving interest from colleges, not just one, but two institutions that saw potential in this well-rounded student-athlete. The college interest represented more than just academic opportunity for Brianna. It symbolized hope, possibility, and a future that stretched far beyond the familiar boundaries of Mishawaka. She often spoke excitedly about her plans, her eyes lighting up when she discussed the possibilities that lay ahead. Those conversations would later take on a heartbreaking quality, serving as reminders of dreams that would never be fulfilled. In many ways, Brianna embodied the best of small-town American youth. She was grounded by strong family values, motivated by personal goals, and connected to her community through sports and school activities. Her parents had raised her to be responsible and thoughtful, qualities that served her well as she navigated the typical challenges of high school life. Yet like many teenagers, she was also learning to make her own decisions, some of which would prove to have consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. Erin Trejo had been part of Brianna's world for most of her life. Their paths first crossed during elementary school, in those early years when friendships form naturally and without the complications that adolescence often brings. Mishawaka was small enough that children who started school together often remained classmates through graduation, creating bonds that could span more than a decade. As they grew older, Erin became known around Mishawaka High School as a football player. He wore the team colors with pride and spent his autumn afternoons on the practice field, working through drills and preparing for Friday night games. Football culture ran deep in Indiana, where high school athletics often serve as the heartbeat of small communities, and Erin found his identity within that world. Like many teenage relationships, whatever connection existed between Erin and Brianna had evolved over the years. Childhood acquaintances sometimes grow into something more during high school, when hormones and emotions run high and young people begin exploring romantic relationships. Their connection was part of the complex social web that defines high school life in small towns, where everyone's business becomes somewhat public knowledge and relationships are often observed and discussed by peers, teachers, and parents alike. What exactly transpired between Erin and Brianna during the months leading up to December 2018 would later become a crucial piece of the puzzle that investigators would need to reconstruct. Their relationship, whatever form it took, would prove to be at the center of a tragedy that no one could have predicted. Erin appeared to be a typical teenager in many ways. He participated in sports, attended classes, and moved through the rhythms of high school life. Yet beneath the surface, he was carrying pressures and fears that would ultimately overwhelm his ability to cope. His young mind was not equipped to handle the weight of the situation that was developing, and his response would reveal just how catastrophic the consequences can be when teenage stress meets poor decision-making. The autumn of 2018 brought an unexpected development that would alter the trajectory of both young lives forever. Brianna discovered she was pregnant, and Aaron was the father. This revelation arrived like a thunderclap in what had presumably been the relatively carefree existence of two high school students. For a 17-year-old girl with college aspirations and a bright future ahead of her, an unplanned pregnancy presented enormous challenges. The weight of this discovery would have been overwhelming for any teenager, but Brianna found herself facing additional complexity because of the circumstances surrounding her relationship with Aaron and the timing of when she became aware of her condition. According to what investigators would later piece together, Brianna did not immediately share the news of her pregnancy with Aaron. Whether this delay was due to fear, uncertainty, denial, or simply the need for time to process the information herself, only she could have said. What became clear was that by the time Aaron learned about the pregnancy, Brianna was already 6 months along, far too late in the pregnancy for many of the options that might have been available earlier. This timing would later become a crucial element in understanding Aaron's state of mind. In his teenage worldview, the delay in learning about the pregnancy had eliminated what he saw as possible solutions to what he perceived as a catastrophic problem. Rather than seeing the pregnancy as a shared responsibility or a challenge to be faced together, Aaron's immature mind fixated on what he viewed as a betrayal, the idea that Brianna had somehow intentionally prevented him from having options. The weight of impending fatherhood at 16 years old would be daunting for any teenager. Aaron was facing the prospect of his entire life changing before he had even graduated from high school. His plans, his identity as a football player, his vision of his future, all of it seemed to crumble in the face of this new reality. Rather than seek support, guidance, or help in processing these overwhelming emotions, Aaron began to internalize his fears and frustrations in ways that would prove dangerous. Meanwhile, Brianna was dealing with her own complex emotions while physically carrying a child that was already well developed. At 6 months pregnant, she was beginning to show, which meant that keeping the pregnancy secret from her family and friends was becoming increasingly difficult. The isolation that often accompanies unplanned teenage pregnancy was likely weighing heavily on her, especially as she contemplated how this development would affect her college prospects and her relationships with those she loved. Living with a secret pregnancy for 6 months required tremendous emotional strength and careful maneuvering of social situations. Brianna had to continue participating in cheerleading activities, maintain her academic performance, and interact with family and friends, all while carrying the knowledge that her life was about to change dramatically. The physical demands of hiding a pregnancy became increasingly difficult as weeks passed. Cheerleading requires athletic movement, energy, and physical coordination, activities that become more challenging as pregnancy progresses. Brianna had to find ways to participate in her normal activities while managing the fatigue, morning sickness, and physical changes that accompany pregnancy. Her ability to maintain this facade for months demonstrates remarkable determination, though it also suggests the level of fear or uncertainty she must have been experiencing. Her relationship with her family during this period remains one of the more heartbreaking aspects of the story. Parents who later spoke about their daughter described a young woman they trusted and felt close to, someone who typically shared important aspects of her life with them. The fact that Brianna felt unable to confide in them about something so significant suggests the enormous pressure she was under and perhaps fear about disappointing them or derailing the college opportunities they had all worked toward. Friends and classmates later reported that they had no idea Brianna was pregnant, which speaks to her determination to maintain normalcy in her daily life. High school environments can be particularly challenging places to keep personal secrets, especially in a small town where gossip travels quickly and everyone seems to know everyone else's business. Brianna's success in maintaining privacy around her pregnancy for so long required careful attention to her behavior, appearance, and interactions with others. The isolation that accompanied this secret-keeping likely took a significant emotional toll. Pregnancy, especially a first pregnancy, can bring a complex mix of emotions even under the best circumstances. Fear, excitement, uncertainty, and anticipation all compete for attention in an expectant mother's mind. For a teenager facing an unplanned pregnancy without family support or guidance, these emotions would have been magnified exponentially. By early December 2018, the secret could no longer be contained. The pregnancy had progressed to the point where Brianna needed to have serious conversations about the future, and that meant finally involving Aaron in discussions about their situation. What had been her solitary burden for months was about to become a shared reality, though the sharing would not unfold as she might have hoped. The decision to meet with Aaron behind her house on the evening of December 8 suggests that Brianna was ready to face whatever consequences would come from finally revealing the truth. She may have spent weeks or even months rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain the delay in telling him, and what kinds of solutions they might explore together. In her mind, this conversation might have represented the beginning of a new chapter in which they would work together to figure out their path forward. The location she chose for this conversation, behind her family home, speaks to both the private nature of what needed to be discussed and perhaps her comfort level with Aaron. This was familiar territory for her, a place where she felt secure. The evening timing suggests she wanted privacy and space to have what would undoubtedly be a lengthy and emotional conversation without interruption from family members or friends. Aaron's state of mind as he approached this meeting would have been far different from Brianna's. While she had lived with the knowledge of the pregnancy for months and had time to process her emotions and begin thinking about practical considerations, Aaron was likely still reeling from the initial shock of learning he was going to be a father. His 16-year-old mind was probably racing with fears about how this development would affect his future, his relationship with his family, his standing among his peers, and his identity as a high school football player. The conversation that took place behind Brianna's house on that December evening was one that only two people would ever fully know, and only one of them would survive to tell investigators what transpired. According to Aaron's later confession, the discussion quickly became heated as his frustration over the timing of the revelation boiled over into anger and accusations. What happened next would forever change multiple families and an entire community. In Aaron's telling, his anger over what he perceived as Brianna's delay in telling him about the pregnancy escalated beyond anything rational or comprehensible. His 16-year-old mind, already overwhelmed by the prospect of fatherhood and the disruption to his life plans, fixated on blame rather than problem-solving. The transition from heated argument to physical violence represents a crossing of a line that can never be uncrossed. Aaron later told investigators that he had brought a knife to the meeting, which suggests some level of premeditation, even if he hadn't necessarily planned to use it. The presence of a weapon transformed what might have remained a verbal argument into something far more dangerous. In a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Aaron stabbed Brianna in the heart. The attack was swift and devastating, targeting the most vital organ in her body. Medical experts would later confirm that such a wound would have been rapidly fatal, meaning that Brianna's life ended quickly, though whether she understood what was happening to her in those final moments remains a question that will never be answered. The violence didn't end with Brianna's death. Aaron's actions had also killed their unborn daughter, whom Brianna had planned to name Aurora, a name that means dawn or new beginning, carrying with it all the hope and possibility that Brianna had felt about bringing this child into the world. Aurora was 6 months along in her development, meaning she was a fully formed baby who would have been viable outside the womb with medical support. 2 lives were lost in that instant of violence, 2 futures that will never be realized. The immediate aftermath of the stabbing would have confronted Aaron with the magnitude of what he had done. The girl he had known since elementary school, someone who had been part of his world for most of his life, was dead by his hand. The baby who represented their shared genetic future was also gone. In a single moment of rage, he had eliminated not only Brianna and Aurora but also any possibility of the future they might have had together as a family. What Aaron did next reveals the panic and poor judgment that often follow violent acts committed by young people who are completely unprepared for the reality of what they've done. Rather than seeking help, calling for medical assistance, or facing the consequences of his actions, Aaron made decisions that would compound the tragedy and add additional trauma for Brianna's family. Aaron wrapped Brianna's body in black plastic bags, treating someone he had known for most of his life as though she were nothing more than refused to be disposed of. This dehumanizing act suggests the psychological state he had entered, where the reality of what he had done was so overwhelming that he compartmentalized his emotions and focused solely on trying to avoid consequences. He then loaded her body into a vehicle and drove to a restaurant area about a block away from Brianna's home. The location he chose was behind a Culver's restaurant, where commercial dumpsters provided what he hoped would be a permanent hiding place for the evidence of his crime. The proximity to Brianna's house meant that Aaron didn't have to travel far with her body, reducing the risk of being seen, but it also meant that the crime scene was uncomfortably close to where her family was probably beginning to wonder where she was. The decision to dispose of Brianna's body in a dumpster represents perhaps the most callous aspect of Aaron's actions that night. This was someone he had known since childhood, someone who had trusted him enough to meet with him privately to discuss their shared future. The casual disposal of her remains suggests a complete disconnection from the humanity of what he had done and the profound disrespect for both Brianna and her family, who would soon be desperately searching for her. After disposing of the body, Aaron apparently attempted to return to some semblance of normal behavior, as though the evening's events could simply be compartmentalized and forgotten. This represents the kind of magical thinking that often accompanies crimes committed by young people who lack the emotional maturity to fully grasp the permanence of their actions and the inevitability of consequences. Brianna's failure to return home that evening would have initially caused concern rather than panic for her family. Teenagers sometimes lose track of time, get caught up in conversations with friends, or experience minor delays that keep them out later than expected. Her parents probably went through the familiar progression of emotions that most parents experience when a child is late, mild annoyance evolving into concern and eventually into genuine worry. As the hours passed and Brianna remained unreachable, her family's concern deepened. In an age of cell phones and constant communication, it was unusual for a responsible teenager like Brianna to be completely out of touch for extended periods. Her parents would have tried calling and texting, possibly reaching out to her friends to see if anyone had heard from her or knew where she might be. The decision to contact law enforcement represents the moment when her family's worry transformed into genuine fear that something serious might have happened. Parents don't typically call police about a teenager who is a few hours late unless they have strong reasons to believe that the absence is out of character and potentially dangerous. Brianna's family knew her well enough to understand that disappearing without communication was not something she would normally do. Law enforcement's initial response would have followed standard protocols for missing person cases involving teenagers. Officers would have gathered information about when Brianna was last seen, who she might have been with, and where she might have gone. They would have asked about any recent changes in her behavior, relationship issues, or other factors that might explain her absence. The fact that Brianna's body was discovered relatively quickly suggests that the search effort was thorough and methodical. Law enforcement officers, possibly assisted by family members and community volunteers, would have canvassed the area around her home, checking locations where a missing teenager might be found. The discovery of her remains in a dumpster behind a nearby restaurant represents every parent's worst nightmare, confirmation that their fears about their child's safety were tragically justified. The moment when Brianna's body was found marked the transformation of a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The location where she was discovered, wrapped in plastic bags and disposed of in a commercial dumpster, immediately told investigators that they were dealing with a deliberate act of violence rather than an accident or natural death. The condition of Brianna's remains would have provided crucial information to forensic investigators. The fact that she had been stabbed in the heart indicated that this was likely a targeted attack rather than a random act of violence. The precision of the wound suggested familiarity with human anatomy or simply luck in hitting such a vital area. Either way, it was clear that whoever had attacked Brianna had intended to kill her. The discovery that Brianna had been 6 months pregnant added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. Not only had someone killed a promising 17-year-old girl, but they had also killed an unborn child who was far enough along in development to be considered viable. This realization would eventually lead to Aaron being charged with both murder and feticide, the killing of a fetus. For Brianna's family, the discovery of her body would have brought the terrible certainty that replaced the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing where she was. The hope that she might still be alive, that there might be some innocent explanation for her absence, was replaced by the devastating knowledge that she was gone forever. The additional revelation that she had been pregnant would have added another dimension of grief. Not only had they lost their daughter, but they had also lost a grandchild they never knew existed. The investigation that followed would need to piece together the final hours of Brianna's life, identify who was responsible for her death, and build a case that could withstand scrutiny in court. The evidence at the scene, combined with witness statements and forensic analysis, would need to paint a clear picture of what had happened and who was responsible. Law enforcement's investigation into Brianna's murder began with the standard questions that drive all homicide cases: who had access to her? Who might have wanted to harm her? What were the circumstances of her final hours? The answers to these questions would lead investigators directly to Aaron Trejo, though the path to those answers required careful police work and methodical elimination of other possibilities. The first crucial break in the case came from examining Brianna's final communications and movements. Investigators would have looked at her phone records, social media activity, and conversations with friends and family members to create a timeline of her last known activities. This process would have revealed that she had plans to meet with someone on the evening she disappeared, and that someone was Aaron. When investigators interviewed Aaron, they would have been looking for inconsistencies in his story, signs of deception, and any evidence that connected him to Brianna's death. 16-year-old suspects often lack the sophistication to maintain complex lies under questioning, especially when they're dealing with the psychological pressure of having committed a violent crime. The forensic evidence at the scene would have supported whatever confession Aaron eventually provided. Blood evidence, fingerprints, DNA, and other physical traces would have either confirmed or contradicted his version of events. The fact that Brianna's body was found so close to her home would have made it relatively easy for investigators to canvass the area for additional evidence and potential witnesses. Aaron's confession, when it came, would have provided investigators with the details they needed to understand exactly what had happened during that December evening meeting. His admission that he had killed Brianna because he was angry about the timing of when she told him about the pregnancy gave investigators the motive they needed to explain the crime. When Aaron Trejo finally broke down and confessed to killing Brianna Rousalong, his words carried the weight of a tragedy that had destroyed multiple lives. "I took her life," he told investigators, a simple statement that acknowledged the enormity of what he had done while simultaneously failing to capture the full scope of the devastation his actions had caused. His explanation for the murder revealed the immaturity and short-sightedness that had driven him to violence. Aaron told investigators that he was angry because Brianna had waited too long to tell him about the pregnancy, making it impossible for them to consider abortion as an option. In his 16-year-old mind, this delay had trapped him in a situation he felt powerless to escape, and his response was to eliminate what he saw as the source of the problem. The confession also revealed the level of planning that had gone into the crime. Aaron admitted to bringing a knife to the meeting, which suggested that he had at least considered the possibility of violence before he actually committed it. Whether he had definitively planned to kill Brianna or simply brought the weapon as a contingency, only he could say, but the presence of the knife indicated that the murder was not entirely spontaneous. Aaron's description of wrapping Brianna's body in plastic and disposing of it in the dumpster demonstrated the calculated nature of his actions after the killing. These were not the panicked responses of someone who had acted in a moment of passion and immediately regretted it. Instead, they suggested someone who was focused on covering up his crime and avoiding consequences, even if it meant treating Brianna's remains with shocking disrespect. The confession process would have been emotionally difficult for everyone involved. For investigators, obtaining confessions in cases involving teenage suspects requires careful attention to legal procedures and the unique vulnerabilities of young suspects. For Aaron, verbalizing what he had done would have forced him to confront the reality of his actions in a way that he had probably been avoiding since the night of the murder. Aaron Trejo's arrest and charging as an adult with murder and feticide marked the beginning of legal proceedings that would ultimately determine his fate and provide some measure of justice for Brianna and Aurora. The decision to charge him as an adult, despite his age of 16, reflected the severity of his crimes and the legal system's recognition that some acts are so serious that they warrant adult consequences regardless of the perpetrator's age. The charges against Aaron carried significant potential penalties. Murder in Indiana can result in life imprisonment, while feticide, the killing of a fetus, carries additional penalties that can be imposed consecutively. These charges meant that Aaron was potentially facing decades in prison, effectively ensuring that his entire adult life would be spent behind bars if he were convicted. Initially, Aaron entered a plea of not guilty, which is standard procedure in serious criminal cases and allows the defense time to review evidence and develop their strategy. However, the strength of the evidence against him, including his own confession, would have made mounting a successful defense extremely challenging. His lawyers would have needed to either challenge the confession itself or argue for some form of mitigation that might reduce his sentence. The legal proceedings took place in St. Joseph County, where the crime had occurred. The courthouse would have been packed with community members, family members of both the victim and the defendant, and media representatives covering a case that had shocked the local area. The presence of so many observers would have added pressure to all participants in the legal process and emphasized the community impact of the crime. For Brianna's family, the legal proceedings represented their opportunity to see justice served for their daughter and granddaughter. However, no legal outcome could restore what they had lost or repair the damage that Aaron's actions had caused. The court process would force them to relive the details of Brianna's death while also learning new information about her final months, including the pregnancy they had known nothing about. In October 2019, nearly a year after Brianna's murder, Aaron Trejo made a decision that surprised many observers of the case. During what was scheduled to be a routine status hearing, Aaron and his legal team announced that he would be changing his plea from not guilty to guilty on both the murder and feticide charges. This development represented a significant shift in the case and eliminated the need for a trial that would have forced Brianna's family to endure testimony about the details of her death. The decision to plead guilty could have been motivated by several factors. Aaron's lawyers may have advised him that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that a trial would likely result in conviction anyway, possibly with harsher sentencing than might be achieved through a plea agreement. The confession he had provided to investigators would have been powerful evidence at trial, and the physical evidence would have supported his admission of guilt. Alternatively, Aaron may have reached a point of genuine remorse where he felt compelled to take responsibility for his actions without forcing the victim's family through the trauma of a trial. A guilty plea would spare Brianna's loved ones from having to hear detailed testimony about her final moments and would eliminate the possibility that Aaron might be acquitted on a technicality or through jury nullification. The timing of the plea change, occurring almost a year after the crime, suggests that Aaron had time to fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had done and the impact it had on multiple families. The initial shock and self-preservation instincts that might have driven his not guilty plea could have given way to a more mature understanding of his responsibility and guilt. The courtroom was reportedly packed when Aaron announced his intention to plead guilty, indicating the continued community interest in the case and the desire for closure among those who had been affected by Brianna's death. The surprise nature of the announcement meant that many observers were unprepared for this development, though it was likely welcomed by those who wanted to see the case resolved without prolonged legal proceedings. On January 7, 2020, Aaron Trejo appeared before Judge John Hurley for sentencing in one of the most emotionally charged hearings the St. Joseph County Courthouse had seen in years. The courtroom was filled with family members, friends, community members, and media representatives, all gathered to witness the final chapter of the legal proceedings that had followed Brianna Rousalong's murder. Judge Hulley's sentencing decision reflected both the severity of Aaron's crimes and the unique circumstances surrounding them. Aaron received 55 years in prison for the murder of Brianna Rousalong and an additional 10 years for the feticide charge related to the death of Aurora, the unborn child. Crucially, the judge ordered that these sentences be served consecutively rather than concurrently, meaning that Aaron would serve a total of 65 years in prison. The consecutive nature of the sentencing was significant because it reflected the court's recognition that two separate lives had been lost and that each deserved individual acknowledgement through the legal system. As Judge Hurley explained during the sentencing hearing, the consecutive sentences were important because there were two lives lost and two families affected by Aaron's actions. Judge Hurley's comments during sentencing revealed his assessment of the crime's severity. He described Aaron's actions as taking Brianna's life, in one of the most savage and violent manners he had seen during his career on the bench. These words carried particular weight coming from an experienced judge who had presided over numerous violent crime cases throughout his tenure. The practical effect of the 65-year sentence meant that Aaron would likely serve at least 75% of his term, according to Indiana's sentencing guidelines. This calculation suggested that Aaron would be approximately 66 years old before he would be eligible for release, effectively ensuring that he would spend the majority of his adult life in prison for his crimes. The ripple effects of Aaron's actions extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass multiple families and an entire community. Brianna's family was left to grieve not only the loss of their daughter but also the granddaughter they had never known existed. The discovery that Brianna had been pregnant added another layer of complexity to their grief, as they processed both the loss and the realization that their daughter had been carrying this secret during her final months. Brianna's parents spoke publicly about their daughter during the legal proceedings, describing her as a good girl who didn't deserve what happened to her. They emphasized her academic achievements, noting that she had been receiving interest from 2 colleges, and painted a picture of a young woman whose future had been bright with possibility. Their statements revealed parents who had lost not only their child but also all the milestones and achievements that would never come to pass. The name that Brianna had chosen for her unborn daughter, Aurora, took on particular poignancy in the aftermath of the crime. Aurora, meaning dawn or new beginning, represented all the hope and possibility that Brianna had felt about bringing her child into the world. The fact that both mother and daughter died together meant that these hopes and dreams died with them, leaving behind only the memory of what might have been. Aaron's family also faced their own form of devastation as they grappled with the realization that their son had committed such a heinous act. Parents, siblings, and extended family members found themselves associated with a crime that shocked their community and challenged everything they thought they knew about Aaron. They faced the dual burden of processing their own emotions about his actions while also dealing with community judgment and media attention. The broader Mishawaka community struggled to understand how 2 teenagers they thought they knew could become involved in such a tragic situation. The crime challenged assumptions about safety, about the predictability of human behavior, and about the hidden pressures that young people might be facing without adult awareness or intervention. The murder of Brianna Rousalong and her unborn daughter Aurora serves as a tragic reminder of how quickly young lives can spiral into irreversible tragedy when overwhelming circumstances meet poor decision-making and a lack of appropriate support systems. The case illustrates several critical issues that communities, families, and educators must grapple with as they work to prevent similar tragedies. The pressure that unplanned teenage pregnancy can place on young people cannot be understated. Both Brianna and Aaron were facing life-altering circumstances that they were not equipped to handle without adult guidance and support. The secrecy that surrounded the pregnancy meant that neither teenager had access to the counseling, medical care, and emotional support that might have helped them navigate their situation more successfully. Aaron's response to learning about the pregnancy reveals the dangerous combination of immaturity, fear, and poor problem-solving skills that can lead to violence when young people feel trapped by circumstances. His fixation on blame rather than responsibility, and his inability to see alternatives to violence, demonstrates the critical importance of teaching young people healthy coping mechanisms and providing them with trusted adults they can turn to during crisis situations. The case also highlights the critical importance of communication between parents and teenagers about sensitive topics including sexuality, pregnancy, and the resources available to young people facing difficult situations. Brianna's decision to keep her pregnancy secret for 6 months suggests that she may not have felt comfortable discussing the situation with her parents, despite their apparently close relationship. For communities, the tragedy underscores the need for comprehensive support systems that can identify young people in crisis and provide them with appropriate interventions before situations escalate to violence. Schools, healthcare providers, and community organizations all play crucial roles in creating safety nets that can catch young people before they fall into desperate circumstances. Today, Brianna Rousalong is remembered not for the tragic way her life ended, but for the bright spirit she brought to the world during her 17 years. Her friends remember her infectious smile and her ability to make others feel welcome and valued. Her teammates remember her dedication to cheerleading and softball, and her commitment to excellence in everything she attempted. Her academic achievements and college prospects serve as reminders of the potential that was lost when her life was cut short. The 2 colleges that had shown interest in her represented pathways to futures that will never be explored, dreams that will never be pursued, and contributions to society that will never be made. Aurora, the daughter Brianna never had the chance to hold, is remembered through her name, a symbol of the new beginning that Brianna had envisioned. Though Aurora never drew breath outside the womb, she represented hope and possibility in her mother's mind, and her memory serves as a reminder of the generational impact of violence that claims multiple lives simultaneously. The tragedy has also sparked conversations within the Mishawaka community about how to better support young people facing crisis situations. Schools have implemented additional counseling resources, and community organizations have developed programs aimed at providing teenagers with safe spaces to discuss difficult topics and access help when they need it. Memorial scholarships established in Brianna's name ensure that her memory continues to support other young people pursuing educational opportunities. These scholarships represent a positive legacy emerging from tragedy, helping other students achieve the college dreams that Brianna herself had been pursuing. The murder of Brianna Rousalong and her unborn daughter Aurora represents one of those senseless tragedies that forces communities to confront uncomfortable truths about the hidden pressures facing young people and the devastating consequences that can follow when those pressures overwhelm immature coping mechanisms. Aaron Trejo's decision to respond to an unplanned pregnancy with violence rather than seeking help or support destroyed multiple lives and futures. His actions not only ended Brianna's promising life and Aurora's potential, but also effectively ended his own future as a free person. The 65-year prison sentence he received ensures that he will spend the majority of his adult life paying for the choices he made during a few crucial moments in December 2018. The case serves as a stark reminder that the teenage years, despite their appearance of carefree youth, can involve life-altering situations that require adult wisdom, support, and intervention. The isolation that both Brianna and Aaron experienced, she with her secret pregnancy, he with his overwhelming fear of fatherhood, created conditions where tragedy became possible. As we remember Brianna Rousalong, we honor not only her memory but also the lessons her story teaches about the importance of communication, support, and the recognition that young people facing overwhelming circumstances need adult guidance rather than being left to navigate crisis situations alone. Her story reminds us that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives mattered, whose dreams were valid, and whose loss creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate tragedy. Brianna was a daughter, a student, a teammate, and a friend. She was someone's future mother, someone's potential wife, someone's expected college graduate. The tragedy of her death lies not only in its violence but in all the tomorrows that will never come, all the accomplishments that will never be celebrated, and all the lives that will never be touched by her presence. In the quiet moments when we reflect on cases like this, we're reminded of the fragility of life and the responsibility we all share to create communities where young people feel safe seeking help when they're overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their maturity to handle. Brianna's story, though it ended in tragedy, continues to speak to the importance of compassion, communication, and the recognition that even in our darkest moments, violence is never the answer. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew her, in the scholarships that bear her name, and in the conversations her story has sparked about how we can better protect and support young people facing crisis situations. Though her voice was silenced too soon, the lessons her story teaches continue to resonate, serving as both a memorial to her life and a call to action for communities everywhere. As we close this story, we remember Brianna Nicole Rousalong not as a victim, but as a young woman whose life had value, whose dreams mattered, and whose memory deserves to be honored. In remembering her story, we commit ourselves to creating a world where other young people in crisis can find help instead of desperation, support instead of isolation, and hope instead of violence. May her memory be a blessing, and may her story serve as a reminder of the preciousness of every life and the importance of choosing compassion over violence, understanding over judgment, and love over fear. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.